Benjamin woke as he did from most nights, in a cold sweat, fresh from a nightmare. Ever since the day he'd held his little brother Byron in his arms, he had this haunting dream. He is run through by a faceless opponent, seeing it from the perspective of a down and injured Byron who screamed out. Every night ended the same way for Ben. He sat up and grabbed the glass of water he kept near, prepared for the inevitable, reoccurring images. This was different. Time was closing in on him. He knew things were fast approaching that would transform this nightmare into reality. Jakin would soon be free. He tossed his covers aside and climbed out of his tent. It was a makeshift animal skin that reeked from travel and 5 years as the primary home of this unknown royal vagabond. He stood taking in the crisp blue early morning as he put on his shirt, a new purchase and nicely stitched. He remarked on the comfort with a passing thought, and he was soon joined by Elizabeth Orrin, his blind female companion. Looking at her face and into her pure white eyes was unsettling as always.
What has you up?
I sensed your distress. You were moaning again.
Benjamin hid his embarrassment in a blank expression. She sensed his reluctance to speak.
Ben, I know you can't, tell me about your nightmare, but it's happening more frequently, and their weight radiates off of you like a stench, worse than your old shirt.
I would like to know why you've been tracking these beasts for days, all the way back to Stonehaven Keep. Now they're dispersed, as if no longer directed?
His changing of the subject was a hint to drop it. Elizabeth Orrin knew better than to argue. After nearly 4 years together on this strange road, he didn't give warnings, and if she pushed, he would go days without speaking to her. Whatever it was that weighed on him, he refused to share, even if he did sometimes entertain small allowances for her to talk about it indirectly.
Let's pull up camp and get moving.
Where are we going?
We're going to meet my brother today.
He'd been waiting for this for a while. The way he'd spoken when Elizabeth asked him about Byron a few nights ago. She thought he was not sure how he saw his brother, as a problem or important. It was hard to tell exactly how Benjamin felt when it came to his brother at all. As they packed up camp, Elizabeth used her power, the ability to use energy to see. When she used it somehow, her skin felt the energy imprint on objects. She learned it could do many things, like be used to understand an opponent's body, finding injuries. Then, she could also read the energies of people like her, shepherds. She had an advantage of understanding their power and how the energy manifested before they ever used their abilities. She had made a few attempts to use her skills to heal people, but she had no luck at all with it so far. Those people were nearly dead when she made her attempts. She finished packing her things and followed slightly behind Benjamin, making sure to listen to his steps so she could match his pace without seeing where they were going.
This is Arkneo Masato, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
The wooden cart rocked softly back and forth along the lumpy dirt road. The swaying made Rally Varek sick, but his will would not allow him to be broken by something so inconsequential. Byron sat in quiet meditation. They had selected the cart as their means of travel from the keep because Byron refused to ride a horse. It wasn't a surprise to Varek. The young man, despite his fearless nature about everything else, was terrified of horses.
I cannot make this entire trip by cart. I'll walk these last few miles.
Byron looked up from under the shadow of his hooded cloak.
If that's what you wish, your boots may not be sturdy enough for that journey, though.
If not, I'll take yours.
Varek leapt from over the side of the cart and nodded to the driver, who'd graciously let them ride for no charge. They were headed into Oberon, the trading center for the surrounding villages of Stonehaven Keep. There, they hoped to track down information about the whereabouts of Benjamin Hain. It had been by Varek's suggestion that they had come here. Varek knew pursuit of the puppeteer's army would be fruitless by now. Darren would have fled, leaving the husks of the Twisted to die off, alone, without direction. They would be hunted and killed by the watchful guards of Stonehaven. Varek's suggestion had pleased Byron, who was only looking to track down his brother, not playing chase with someone so feeble in battle. Byron simply returned himself to meditative thought as he focused on what his next purpose would be once he had found his brother. He barely absorbed the smells and sights as the cart drew into the city of Oberon. Varek had walked along at a brisk pace for the last few miles, and was none the worse for wear. Byron finally drew himself out of his self-imposed trance and looked around the city and listened to the crowd. He quickly sensed something was wrong.
What's happening here?
There's a man shooting flames at the crops outside the city.
Byron looked at Varek and they nodded at each other. He helped Byron off the cart.
Sounds like one of us.
Byron almost smiled.
Be careful. Stay near me.
They now could see the smoke billowing from just beyond the other side of the city walls. They ran full speed towards an unknown enemy, probably a shepherd. Like them, a being with the ability to wield fire, but that's all they knew. It was dangerous to take on any shepherd without having somehow gauged his powers and abilities first, but both Byron and Varek knew they couldn't afford a crop loss this close to fall harvest. The crops here fed much of the surrounding lands and kept this outpost flush with goods and trade. If a large amount were burned, it would send everything into chaos. Byron was the first to see their enemy and pointed him out to Varek, who whispered to him, even though they were still a good several hundred feet away.
Listen. Get in close after I distract him.
Byron nodded and began the pour inside his mind to summon his strength. Varek drew his swords that he kept on each hip and twirled them using the sound they made to draw the attention of his target. Byron used a burst of speed to get behind the man. Byron took note of the man's body. It wasn't that he wielded flame. His body was covered in fire, though not to an extent to obscure his features.
Don't y'all know it's rude to sneak up on someone?
Byron swore under his breath.
I could feel the air shift as you ran up on me. You're quite fast.
The man hadn't even turned to face him yet, and this both annoyed and unsettled Byron.
We don't take kindly to fire people burning our lands. We'd like it if you'd stop, but I'd like it even more if you made me make you stop.
The name is Zeke, and before you get all puffed up, y'all might want to go look to your right.
Byron again swore under his breath. Varek was closing the distance with them and would start the fight soon. Byron didn't have time to yell. What he had missed on his approach was several houses burning that had been obscured by the tall crops. The crops reached almost to their roofs. Byron counted 3. They were wood and straw. They were far enough away that there was no way to tell if people were inside them. He didn't hesitate once he made his choice. He ran the several hundred yards to check them. He knew his body would hurt after this, but he didn't have time to consider the risks. Varek would be angry again. The first of the 2 houses were empty. Byron had searched them thoroughly. The houses were being consumed by flames and could easily collapse at any moment. He felt his muscles twitch from the strain of increasing his speed, but pushed the feeling to the back of his mind. Convinced this home was empty, he passed through the door to the second home and heard a cry.
Help me!
Byron took off without a single thought except rescuing whoever was there. As soon as he crossed the threshold to the entrance of the small one-room home, he saw a small boy pinned by broken wood and some hay. The wood looked to be part of a support for the roof. Byron shifted his pour and his muscles, tendons, bones, and skin began to respond.
I'm gonna get you out of here.
He lifted the wood and found the boy's ribs were badly bruised. He quickly snatched him up and carried him out at a quick pace, but holding the boy gently in such a fashion to make sure he wasn't jostled too much. Byron got beyond the threshold of the door and began to walk, looking for the fight between Varek and the man covered in flames.
Did y'all think my information was a kindness?
Byron swore again, and instinctively turned himself away while covering the boy's ears. He felt the flames burning his back and sides of his face. He felt his armor straps fall off, and he wondered how he could protect this boy and mount some kind of defense. His cloak began to burn away, and the flames stopped. He made no guess as to why this happened. Byron simply stood up, turned, and removed the remains of his cloak, revealing his identity.
That was my favorite armor.
Byron wouldn't have spoken normally, but the look of shock on the man's face made an instant attack hard to muster up.
Wait, you're...
Byron smirked for only a second, but then his face turned deadly serious.
Yes, I am.
Byron cracked his knuckles.
This is gonna hurt.
Byron didn't increase his speed. He didn't need to. He figured Zeke wasn't used to close combat, as he seemed to wield fire at a distance. He closed the 20 feet that was between them so quickly, in fact, Zeke had little time to mount any type of defense. Byron congratulated himself on his assessment as Zeke tried to attack with flames from his hands. Byron grabbed both of the man's arms and broke them right below the elbow. and then for good measure, he kicked the man below each knee, breaking both of his legs. Byron glared at him. He was still holding Zeke up by his now broken arms.
I don't like people who threaten lives.
He pushed Zeke to the ground.
Especially when those threatened are children.
The man's wails were loud for a short moment, but shock soon set in and he fell unconscious. Byron realized suddenly that he still had the boy behind him down on the ground in a pile of charred crops. Byron wiped his expression from the previous moments and knelt down carefully, as he'd seen his father do many times with small children who were afraid of the strange man in royal robes and the big scary horse.
Are you all right?
He extended his hand. He'd hoped the boy hadn't seen the confrontation moments ago, and his hope was rewarded when the boy reached out his hand.
It's going to be okay.
Byron scooped the boy up, careful to remember his injured ribs. He knew he needed to hurry. He could already feel his breath starting to leave him. He'd used his powers for longer than ever before. He carried the boy back to where he'd seen Zeke, looking for Varek. The man lay knocked out, but otherwise unharmed, save a few burns to his new pants. Byron snorted.
Serves you right.
He held down and picked up his bodyguard with one arm and slung him over his shoulder. It was several hundred yards to the outer gates of the city, and Byron groaned as he began his long walk towards it. He'd barely gotten to the gate before his feet gave way. People gathered around him as he lay on his side. His only comfort from the pain of straining his body was the cold, half-wet dirt that washed into his senses as he lost his vision.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
When Byron woke suddenly, a woman eased him down as he groaned in pain.
Easy, easy. You're in my home. Safe. It's all right. Does this always happen?
Does what happen?
You know, I've seen others like you who come back gravely wounded from battle. Some never wake up, or they suffer from great weakness and pain.
He wasn't panicked by his surroundings. As he opened his eyes, he saw neither the boy nor Varek anywhere in the room that looked to be in a small inn.
The two people I carried back.
Don't worry, they're both safe. The boy, he's my son. I thought we had all fled to the city together, but my husband and I were separated.
The pain is penance for using our gifts, powers, or whatever you want to call them.
Then why would anyone ever use powers like that at all?
Byron reached out a hand involuntarily and found hers, giving it a gentle squeeze.
Because I can, and so I should.
He winced as his body mocked his motto by sending a wave of tense pain through him.
I'm in your debt, Prince Byron.
Please, just Byron.
He went back to his first train of thought when he awoke.
Where's Varek?
That bodyguard of yours? He said he had to go back into the fields.
When he gets back, wake me up.
Byron turned onto his side and bent his knees, so that the burns on his back could stretch a bit. He grimaced at the slight sting, but it wasn't any worse than getting sunburned. He had been lucky. He'd guessed when his skin didn't catch fire, it had confused his opponent. Then, revealing his identity had paralyzed the man with a double shock. He smiled to himself.
Yeah, wake me up. I want to punch him square in the face.
He closed his eyes and allowed sleep to take him peacefully this time, rather than by force the way it had near the gate.
This is writer-director Joshua Kasparek, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Meanwhile, out in the fields, Varek was looking for the man who'd knocked him out using a burst of flame to suck up all the surrounding oxygen. Varek knew why Zeke had chosen not to kill him, but that little fact needed to remain secret for now. Varek had figured Byron wouldn't kill him, but he was impressed with the state of the man when he found him lying in a pile of half-burned crops. The man's joints were bent all along at all four limbs, and Varek knelt down to have a closer look before waking the unconscious man. Raleigh figured he would extract information before he decided the man's final fate.
That looks like it hurts.
He poked the man with a dried corn stalk along his face, allowing the end to drift into one of his eyes. Varek remarked on the smell of the burned crops and how mixed with the slight cold of an early fall day, he found it quite pleasant.
Wake up!
The man did, to the surprise of the bodyguard, who knelt at the foot of his body.
Zeke, you and I are going to have a little chat.
He sat down alongside Zeke, careful not to press any of his limbs. The man was already in shock, his face covered in sweat and losing color by the second.
You remember me, don't you, Zeke?
The man nodded.
What were you doing here?
Zeke tried to lift his head to answer, but cried out in pain and returned it to the laying position.
I was meant to cover Darren's retreat. I decided to have a little fun before I left is all.
Zeke groaned again as he mulled over his careless mistake. Varek saw the man's thoughts reflected in his eyes.
Don't worry. I don't think you'll have much time to regret your disobedience anyway.
Zeke's eyes opened in realization.
No. Wait, no!
Zeke didn't have a chance to think about moving as Varek's hand forcefully clasped his neck. The hand absorbed something from the body, and Varek's veins showed a dark red as it branched all the way along his arm. Varek's eyes turned solid green and shined for several moments. When he finished, Varek pulled his hand back and looked at it. It looked like a normal hand, but when he saw the aftermath, it always made him want to check it for a wound or a mark. Something that would indicate its power, but nothing ever did. He looked at Zeke's corpse, now drained of life, gray and old. The uninitiated would assume that Varek had taken his blood, but that wasn't the case. He'd absorbed Zeke's life energy to feed his own dark hunger. Varek shook his thoughts off quickly, realizing someone might see him. Luckily in this field, they were surrounded by tall crops for the most part. Even the burned crops still stood like a wall protecting the man's secret.
That's for ruining my pants.
He stood up, and as he looked around, he noticed something several feet away. The remains of Byron's cloak, his leather cuirass, and his sword lay on the ground. He picked up the sword and noticed the sheath was mostly melted. His eyes widened as he realized how hot that must have been on Byron's back. But when he had checked the boy's injuries back at the inn in town, the boy had shown only mild sunburn.
You are stronger than even I know.
Varek stripped off the melted sheath. The sword was completely undamaged. He began to trek back to the outer gates of Oberon, slipping the sword into a temporary holding place in his jacket, where he sometimes carried a backup weapon. They needed to get moving soon. Jakin would soon know that something was wrong when Zeke didn't return, and that might speed up his aggression. Byron wasn't fully ready for that confrontation. They had to find Benjamin before that happened. In all the chaos at the time they had entered the city, they hadn't asked a single person about Benjamin. When Byron woke, it was with greater ease, and his body had largely recovered from his earlier battle. He swung himself from the bed and let his bare feet touch the wood flooring. He cursed as he remembered the loss of his cloak and his shirt, his armor, and sword. When he got to the thought of his sword, he panicked and he tried to get up.
Are you looking for this?
Varek held out the sword in his right hand as he twirled it with a flick of his wrist. He knew the panic in Byron's face. Few things upset him more than when he couldn't find his sword. It was his prized possession, though he did not know much about how to use it. Byron's feeling of relief was instant but short-lived as the other things that needed replaced rushed back to the front of his mind.
I need a new shirt and armor.
We'll take care of that before we leave. I've located the last whereabouts of your brother. You've been asleep for nearly a day. We should set out once you've eaten something.
Byron nodded his compliance with the direction Varek had set. Though he often clashed with the man tasked with his protection, he liked his bluntness. It made for less awkward or useless conversation.
Here, take this.
Varek tossed his jacket to Byron. It was a temporary measure until they replaced Byron's clothes. Varek didn't mind the crisp, cool fall weather anyway. They left without bidding farewell to the woman running the inn, as she had disappeared to help tend to the cleanup of the farm since there wasn't a rush at the inn. Byron wrote her a kind note, and Varek left some unsolicited payment. The room and beds were very plain, in stark contrast when the two men stepped from the doorway and out into the open. It was right into the markets, which were few, but at least 100 people talked, haggled, shopped, browsed, and loaded carts as the late afternoon signaled dusk. And most people would want to have all of their goods bought and prepped before setting off the next morning. Byron was glad he still had a pair of boots to slip on before stepping out there. The road was lined on each side with logs, but not paved. This meant that the ground was hard or mushy depending on where one stood. Byron hated few things, but one was dirty feet. He followed Varek as the man showed him to a small shop tucked behind a hunting post. The shop they went into was a simple clothing shop. There wasn't even a sign visible from the main street side. It wasn't more than a single room of space with piles of folded pants and shirts of all soft brown or darkish yellow. Byron scoffed. He always preferred white. It matched his hair, and he felt it looked cooler. He picked out a shirt that fit, and then fastened his pants and sword belt over it, giving it a freshly tucked look. His gaze found Varek's, looking for some kind of approval.
It looks alright. Keep the jacket. I don't think the armor here will work. I checked for some for myself before I came to see you up and about.
Varek looked uninterested in his circumstance. Byron nodded his appreciation for the shared information. He too wanted to get on with this and track down his brother.
What about a sheath for my sword?
Byron pulled on his shirt a little bit to try and make it sit more comfortably on his neck and shoulders.
We'll probably have to ask one of the mercenaries in town if they have one they can spare.
The shopkeeper appeared in the doorway with a stack of freshly folded clothing, and Byron made sure to help the man set them down. He was quite aged. He had a balding top with curly hair running in a horseshoe around the sides and the back of his head. The man looked very surprised, but graciously accepted the help. Byron left the man payment in quick order, as he realized the man knew who he was, and Byron hated when people acted so overwhelmed around him. It made him horribly anxious. Varek walked alongside Byron as they left the shop, their feet in odd lockstep as they made their way out to the street again.
Let's get you some food.
Varek pointed to where there was a shop made out of wood, like most buildings, but this one stood out with some canvas shades where openings for window panes could go. The smell hit Byron instantly as they stepped through the dining hall doors, which were open to let out the heat of the 3 big ovens and 2 big cauldrons. Byron's mouth began to fill with saliva. His stomach hadn't been fed since yesterday morning, and even then he had his typical small breakfast. He felt blessed that they had enough money to buy several £100 of food. Despite not having his cloak to cover his identity, only a few people gave Byron's unique features a passing glance. The dining hall was just as busy as the market with chatter, and even some song by a guitar player who had a decent but forlorn approach to singing. A man came once they seated themselves on the end of an open bench in front of one of the 3 long tables that sat inside the hall.
What would you like?
Byron thought for a moment while Varek answered.
I'll have your best brew, a slice of bread, and a bit of that roasted chicken I smell.
The man nodded his understanding and then looked to Byron.
Do you have any freshly baked bread that has just come out of the oven?
Yes.
Okay then, I'll have the loaf, some cheese, pickles, and some of your chicken.
Certainly. Would you like thick slices of cheese or a wheel?
Slices are fine.
Varek reached for his bag of coins.
No need for that, sir. The owner said to serve you on the house.
On the house?
Yes, sir. The boy you saved was his son.
What's your name?
It's Eric, sir.
Eric's face read slight confusion, but Byron recognized some fear there as well.
Tell the owner we appreciate his kindness. We will leave some coin for the food, and for him to rebuild his home.
Yes, sir.
I will speak to him once we are finished.
Byron could feel Varek's irritated gaze upon him.
You're determined to spend our entire sum of actual money before we even clear our first stop.
I don't want to hear anything about it from you.
Byron turned his face to the direction of Varek, next to him, but didn't meet his gaze.
Had you not been so easily handled by our friend with fire hands, I would not have lost my shirt.
Varek wanted to be angry, even indignant, but Byron was right.
I'm sorry. The situation caught me a little off guard.
He wanted to shift some blame to Byron, but he swallowed the impulse when he caught the purple irises meeting his eyes now.
I just don't think you should worry so much about our money when people are suffering and we can help them.
Varek nodded, and their food arrived shortly afterward, and the 2 ate in silence. They set out with the dawn, collecting a sheath from a mercenary on their way out of town. Byron grabbed a cloak, which didn't really fit like his last one, from a vendor who allowed them passage on his only half-full cart of animal skins and canvases. The cloak was a better color, though, a soft gray, and it was thicker, built to keep out the cold. Byron liked the warmth around his ears, so despite the short back, which barely passed his mid-back, the prince didn't complain. They'd traveled in silence for about 10 minutes, when a shout from a rotting oak caught the attention of the driver and both passengers. The cart stopped as the driver reined in the horses, while simultaneously shouting woe to the animals.
Hey, I hear you've been looking for me.
The shout echoed through the morning for several seconds. Byron knew that voice. He leapt out of the cart without a thought, and Varek followed, unsure of the boy's intentions. The figure from the tree leapt down from it, settling easily upon the ground, almost as if guided by an invisible hand. Byron drew back his hood, his anger dripping from his features. The other man's face was now just visible in the early morning sun. Byron didn't even truly acknowledge the identity of the man in his mind before he pounced. The speed was so quick, Benjamin Hayne had no chance to react. He took the punch that came square on the side of his face. Byron took a combat stance and created a little distance despite being crowded by the tree, cart, and a restrictive path, bordered by 2 small hills on either side of it.
Really? Is this what you want?
The question was punctuated by Ben spitting blood out of his side of his mouth and then taking his own stance.
Fine.